Some have described the Wild West as a region, a wild place that was the West, difficult to reach, largely undomesticated, and uncultivated. In other words, wild. According to popular culture, the West was a raucous and violent place to live where anybody and everyone fought for water, rights, and land. In part, the absence of a centralized authority is to blame for how we all imagine the Wild West. What is equally true, though, is that there were times of peace that continued long enough to permit settlers to improvise social norms. In today's video, we'll be talking about the Old West. Why was it called the Old West? What most of us imagine. Figure you just got into town. Outlaws have wreaked havoc on the once thriving post, robbing the bank, waylaying travelers on the trail, relieving prospectors of their valuables, and killing innocent civilians. You hope to work with law enforcement as a bounty hunter. As you move further in, you notice that the main street is eerily deserted. As you dismount, a movement from what turns out to be the town's salon catches your attention from the corner of your eye. The horse needs water, and you're tired, so you make a beeline for the hitching post, tie your horse, and then walk towards the salon, bracing yourself to face whatever's beyond the door. The year is 1880. The town is Gammons Gulch, Cochise County, Arizona. The reality. The storyline is so common and familiar that most of us, at least at first, want to believe that's what the West was mostly about, were it not for two realities. First, Hollywood thrives on action and exaggeration. It has to. They have only about an hour to captivate and sell tickets. The more outrageous the story, the better. The other reality is history. People moved from the East to the West and developed recognizable cultural elements like rodeos. From these, we must surely conclude that there was more than crime and heroism. Some have described the Wild West as a region, a wild place that was the West, difficult to reach, largely undomesticated and uncultivated. In other words, wild. Others view it as a period of years that strange things happened in the Old West. This is probably why some folks refer to it as the Wild Wild West, although maybe it's just Will Smith's catchy song that starts playing in their heads. Let's start with the place. All agree that the Old West generally refers to the regions beyond the Mississippi River. 11 states are considered part of the Old West. These are Utah, South Dakota, Oregon, North Dakota, New Mexico, Nevada, Montana, Idaho, Colorado, California, and Arizona. Parts of Kansas, parts of Oklahoma, and western Texas are also parts of the Wild West. Many of these states still honor their western history by hosting rodeos and other similar events. And now, the history. The Lewis and Clark Expedition of 1804 to 1806 was commissioned by President Thomas Jefferson. This was after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, which saw America nearly double its size by adding some 828,000 square miles, stretching from the Mississippi River in the east to the Rocky Mountains. Strange as buying land with people as property is, it happened. After the Lewis and Clark Expedition, more merchants, fur traders, and trappers forged the path across the Continental Divide. The wild part. One of those paths became the most established and is what we now know as the Oregon Trail. The more than 2,100-mile route that started from Independence, Missouri to Oregon City was the only passable road, albeit only by foot or horseback. A massive journey by any standards. It's missionaries who blazed the Oregon Trail, led by a merchant. Most travelers believe it to be for God. I dare say, of course, for self and maybe for country, as we must love our neighbors as ourselves. In 1834, this group built an outpost in present-day Idaho. Along the way, they recorded being confronted by an unforgiving terrain, harsh weather, treacherous waters, starvation, injuries, disease, and both hostile and friendly Native Americans. The journey was treacherous and the place, well, very wild. Bigger expeditions followed, including the infamous Great Immigration that commenced on May 22, 1843, when 1,000 men, women, and children departing from Missouri headed west on the Oregon Trail. This event is immortalized in an educational video game and a phone app. The journey west was difficult and dangerous in many ways. Many trail users died from disease. In the years of the cholera outbreak of 1849 to 1855, this disease alone claimed the lives of up to 3% of all travelers. Hypothermia, drownings during river crossings, and being run over by wagons were some of the added common causes of death. There were some unintentional gun deaths, which is sad as we still don't seem to be able to handle guns many years later. It's said 1 in 10 of the people who set out for this 5 to 6 month journey died along the way. So if the journey was so dangerous, why did people risk life and limb to get to the West? It's said Americans migrated west primarily in search of better and healthier lifestyles. Pioneers traveled the Oregon Trail in search of a new home, since land in the West was cheap. The wild wealth. The other reason was gold. The California gold rush began in January 1848, after gold was found in the American River Sierra Nevada section. Tales about people who elected to take shortcuts in favor of speed abound. The dream of wild riches could not allow them to weigh the dangers. The shorter routes reduced travel time by almost 7 days, but covered about 45 miles of desert with little access to water, vegetation, or fuel for fires. Far more people lost everything they possessed than got wealthy. Following the Civil War, Western settlements increased in part because of the railroad. Yet settling was not easy. Immigrants had to start life again in a frequently untamed environment. Life was difficult since everyone had to rely on the land to survive. Families had to learn to handle the roller coaster that was the Western way of life. After 1860, most of the army forces were withdrawn, and miners and ranchers started dispersing across the nation. This led to frequent infringements on Native American territory, greatly increasing Native violence. However, so did the incentives to immigrate. The Homestead Act, which Congress passed in 1862, granted 160 acres of free estate to each immigrant or family who agreed to use the area for development for at least 5 years. Certainly not a bad deal, don't you agree? With limited access to qualified medical care and less than ideal living conditions, the average lifespan was 35 years. The cowboys and guns. Once the immigrants settled, the cattle industry prospered and brought in large sums of money, making cowboys crucial. Cowboys took care of the cattle. It was laborious. Cowboys were concerned about stampedes, which occur when cows take off running and stomp anything or anyone in their path. There were always worries that cattle rustlers may take the cows. Unlike what you see in the movies, they simply didn't have time to get in gunfights all the time. They didn't hunt down Native Americans either. Bar fights weren't just innocuous sparring matches where no one was actually wounded, and prostitutes weren't all good. Guys could not saunter along, pull a gun from a holster, and accurately shoot another man at 50 yards while using only one hand. Particularly not with the poor quality revolvers they lugged around. All of these are Hollywood Wild West. The main goal of their weaponry was to eliminate wild animals that presented a threat to the cattle, the cowboys' real-life Wild West. This is not to suggest there weren't sporadic clashes between competing groups, and there were undoubtedly some terrible people beyond the frontier, particularly former Confederate raiders who continued to conduct raids after the war. It wasn't constant murder, though. If the Old West was difficult for settlers, it was even harder for Native Americans, who paid with their land and lives for trusting politicians. The government broke its promises and took most of their land, leaving tribes with only reservations. If all these do not count for wildness, then maybe nothing does. The real origin of the Wild West. Nonetheless, many people believe, with good reason, that the name Wild West exclusively refers to a 30-year period. They say that the Wild West in American history was an era characterized by lawlessness, an era filled with cowboys, pioneers, Native Americans, gunfighters, and lawmen trying to maintain law and order. According to them, the Wild West began in 1865, when the American Civil War came to an end. There was no police station or fire agencies. It was challenging to enforce the law. As one would expect, society in the West was generally less organized than in the more civil East. The rural aspect of the West made it a perfect place for lawlessness. Prostitution, fighting, alcoholism, and gambling were widespread. The neighborhood saloon served as a regular hangout for many men. The lack of adequate law enforcement in many places resulted in a variety of crimes and societal ills. While some sheriffs lacked the tools to fight crime, others were themselves rather corrupt. In the West, banditry was a widespread issue. Famous people in the Wild West include lawman Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, Billy the Kid, Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, Frank and Jesse James, and the Clanton Gang. The 1881 gunfight at OK Corral is by far the most notorious event supported by facts. The most trustworthy historical records claim that it ended in just 1 minute. It happened on October 26th in Tombstone, Arizona, after months of mounting tensions between lawmen, the Earp brothers, and a gang of outlaw cowboys. The feud was finally settled, with 3 of the outlaws dead and the rest doing a runner. Embellished thrillers on video and in print about these people and events abound. The screeching end of the Wild West. The Wild West period is considered to have ended in 1895. The romanticized cowboy era had abruptly ended several years before. Two harsh winters in 1885 to 86 and 86 to 87, immediately followed by two very dry summers, killed 80 to 90% of the cattle on the plains, putting a stop to the protracted cattle drives. Company ranches took the place of those run by individuals. 1895 was 30 years after the end of the Civil War, when most of the West was well populated. Western cities like Seattle and Los Angeles were already crowded at that time. The majority of rural West areas had already become populated, and the growth did not stop. Today, 58% of Americans reside beyond the Mississippi River as a result of population growth. So, what do you think? Is the Wild West a place, an era, or both? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our channel.